Back in the 50s, 1 in 3 American workers belonged to a union. Today, that number is 1 in 10. Now, we regularly see headlines of union booms going on. However, the numbers paint a very different story.
Companies like Amazon, Starbucks, and Apple are facing union pushes really across the country.
Unions have actually declined in the past couple of decades. At a time when people's real wages are on the decline, the question we need to explore is, do we need more unions? Or does unionization bring more harm than good? And that's exactly what we'll explore in today's video. First, let's discuss what we mean by unions. In essence, a union is a voluntary association of workers that makes use of collective bargaining. The idea is that if you're a lone employee, you don't have much negotiation power against your employer. If you think your work conditions are bad, or if you're not being paid well, or if you're not being rewarded for your efforts, the only real threat you can make is to quit. And one employee quitting will hardly impact an employer's bottom line. They can just hire someone else, and probably for cheaper, especially with big multinational corporations who employ thousands of employees. One employee quitting is not going to make a difference. One employee is simply a replaceable cog in a giant machine. But now imagine, in that giant machine, what if all the cogs stopped working at the same time? The machine simply stops working, and that in essence is what unions can do. They create a situation where employees are represented with strength in numbers. And the theory is that this creates a situation where employers must take the time to listen, to take feedback, to improve as needed based on the collective feedback or the collective bargaining from employees. But like I said, that's just the theory. In reality, things get very complicated, and there are situations that make real-life unionization a much less appealing prospect for employees. It's also very important to understand how a union is structured. Ideally, unions should be democratic, where the wishes of all employees are taken into account. That's the purpose of the union after all, to have one voice. However, as with any organization, the risk of hierarchies developing is very real. This in turn can lead to some workers in the union having a disproportionate influence. In some instances, the more influential workers can promote policies that benefit themselves at the cost of the other workers. If we take a skeptical approach of unions, you can imagine a scenario where a union leader pressures employees in the union to take a less than favorable deal when it comes to employee benefits. And in return, these leaders get favorable terms from the employers. Now, obviously, this is a very bad representation of unions, but these scenarios do happen a lot. Next, you should consider that unions are expensive. They have fees that each member must pay, and these are called union dues. And these cover costs like lawyers' fees and much more. So an employee joining a union might actually end up paying part of their wages just for being part of a union. Now, despite all of this, the numbers don't lie. Unions can be good. And this is not just for the workers, but for employers as well. Take, for example, the Nordic countries, which have the highest union density in the world. Workers generally enjoy higher wages in these countries for the same role compared to other similarly rich countries. At the same time, they also work some of the lowest number of hours in the world. Despite this, Nordic countries boast some of the highest productivity levels in the world, and their businesses remain competitive globally. Even in the US, where the unions are not as well structured, their benefits are statistically visible. On average, full-time union members earned $200 more per week compared to those without a union. Alright, we talked a little bit about what unions are and how they can be beneficial, and also a skeptical view of unions. But having said all of that, we need to now understand, where did unions even come from? By the way, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We put out weekly videos on finance and history topics, so make sure to check out the rest of our catalog. Alright, now back to the topic of unions. If we look back at history, we'll see a lot of organizations that resemble trade associations. Trade associations are like guilds, and they've existed since the beginning of civilization almost. They were generally used to pool resources to help workers and to help skilled craftsmen. Now, trade unions, however, are slightly different. Unions were used to help improve work conditions, as opposed to being about pooling resources. And this idea about improving work conditions and thinking about worker welfare didn't really come into play until much later. That's why we see unions beginning to appear during the Industrial Revolution. that's when this became very prevalent. In the late 18th century, employees started to rebel against poor conditions of many workplaces. On top of that, there was this atmosphere of suspicion from employers that workers could always do more, they could have more productivity. They wanted to squeeze more out of their workers. And this idea of pushing back against employers started the trade union movement. You see, the life of a peasant back in medieval times was harsh, for sure. However, a few centuries later, the life of an industrial worker is pretty brutal as well. Around the 18th century, things got really bad. Many people were put to work as soon as they reached the age of 5. They would work long 16-hour shifts on repetitive tasks with no breaks and no holidays. Workplaces were unsafe, unsanitary, and dangerous. The average lifespan of an industrial worker during that time was less than 25 years. And despite this, the rich industry tycoons would often lament that their workers weren't working hard enough for them. Now, it's important to remember that many of these early trade unions were extensions of existing trade guilds by skilled laborers. As I mentioned earlier, guilds have existed since the Middle Ages. Guilds were an association of artisans and merchants who would oversee the practice of their craft or trade in a particular territory. The earliest types of guilds formed as organizations of tradespeople belonging to a professional association. So when industrialization came about, many of these specialized craftsmen ended up working in factories. However, these craftsmen had a history of being parts of guilds, and they had a generational knowledge about how guilds were organized and how to mobilize people in their professions or groups. So these workers ended up using their experience from the earlier guilds and brought them into this newer concept of unions. A lot of these skilled workers would immigrate to the English New World colonies and import the concept of unionizing. The only difference was now that the focus would be on welfare as opposed to pooling resources. Now, what about the unskilled laborers? They would end up fighting for decades to even legally form unions, and they had an uphill battle with opposition from almost everybody. Industrialists, managers, and politicians were all against unskilled workers from forming unions. Even the middle-class unions tried to prevent ordinary laborers from organizing. It would not be until 1868 that workers were finally able to achieve some breakthrough. Now, when we talk about unions, it's important to understand the difference between the unions in the US versus the unions in Europe. What I mentioned earlier so far was mostly about unions in Europe. In the United States, unions were following their own trajectory. Unions may have remained confined to skilled trades for the better part of the 19th century. Only at the advent of the 20th century would unskilled laborers begin to organize in the US. This slow pace of progress was mainly because public support for unions wasn't as strong in the US. There was this belief that anyone could get rich regardless of their background if they just worked hard. In addition, the social class structure in America wasn't as divided as they were in Europe. In Europe, the aristocratic heritage made class relations even more hostile. By the way, I made a video about feudalism recently that explores this topic a bit better, so check it out over here. Now, in the US, the workers weren't subject to as horrific and brutal work conditions as they were in Europe, and they were compensated substantially more. Now, having said that, unions did evolve in the US over time, and they became stronger. Labor unions would eventually reach their peak in the 60s and 70s, representing almost 35% of US workers. However, from there onwards, globalization and deregulation would weaken the general bargaining power of laborers. You see, in recent years, we're seeing more and more businesses and politicians increasing their hostility towards unionization, especially in the US. Employers in the US would end up having an upper hand in dismissing unionization because in the US there was a rise in union wage premium, increased foreign competition, and government deregulation policies. In contrast, in European countries, they were able to preserve their unions a bit better than the US. And this was because of two developments. Number one was that workers developed a tradition of bargaining not at the company level, but more for the entire sector. And second was the formation of the European single market, which meant that labor could move freely to more worker-friendly states, which meant that the labor class had more leverage. What this meant was that inside the EU, unions impacted all companies within a sector, so they had more power, they had more government support, which meant that businesses weren't as hostile to unions as compared to the US. It created a situation where businesses felt that they could lose valuable workers more easily if they tried to suppress unions. Now, in the example of Europe, it appears that unions do work. It's not a perfect system, but we can see how many average employees in the EU can benefit from this. Now, despite this, we see many influential business owners in the US completely opposed to the idea. I think unions are generally good in theory. As with all things in life, it comes down to execution, and the execution of unionization depends heavily on legacy. You see, Europe's historical class structures influenced how unionization worked there. Feudalism had a pretty big role to play in terms of class structure. So, if you liked this video, I'm sure you're gonna like this video that I made about feudalism. Check it out over here, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week.